The lobby of the Grandview Hotel looked exactly like what I'd expected from a mid-tier downtown Portland establishment. Polished but worn, the kind of place business travelers chose when their company wanted to save money but still maintain some dignity. Burgundy carpet with gold trim ran from the entrance to the front desk, and the brass fixtures had that particular shine that suggested regular cleaning rather than quality. I'd walked past this building dozens of times during my 2 years at Portland State, never imagining I'd end up working here. Rebecca Davis stood behind the front desk, her auburn hair pulled back in a bun so tight it looked like it might give her a headache. She had the kind of professional smile that hotel managers must practice in the mirror, warm enough to seem genuine, controlled enough to maintain authority. When I approached, she looked me up and down once, taking in my black slacks and burgundy button-up shirt, the uniform I'd bought specifically for this job. "Dylan Martinez? That's me. Good. You're punctual." She glanced at her watch. "Night shift starts at 11, and you'll have about an hour of overlap with me to learn the basics. This isn't a complicated job, but there are some specific protocols we follow." I pulled out a small notebook, the kind I used for taking lecture notes. Rebecca noticed and nodded approvingly. The previous night manager left very detailed instructions. His name was Mr. Calhoun. Worked here for 2 years before he stopped showing up about 3 weeks ago. Never called, never left any notice. Just vanished. She paused, running her finger along the edge of a manila folder. He was particular about certain procedures, but they kept things running smoothly during the overnight hours. Rebecca opened the folder and pulled out a laminated sheet of paper. Even from where I stood, I could see it had a numbered list in neat, precise handwriting. She slid it across the marble countertop toward me. "Mr. Calhoun insisted that every night shift employee follow these rules exactly. No exceptions, no modifications. I don't pretend to understand all of them, but we haven't had any major incidents since he implemented them, so we maintain his system." I picked up the laminated list. At the top, in block letters, someone had written, "Night shift protocols, mandatory compliance." Below that, 6 rules were listed in the same careful handwriting. 1. Never use the elevator between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. 2. All guests must be in their rooms by 1 a.m., no exceptions. 3. Room 371 stays empty. Do not book under any circumstances. 4. Remain in office from 3:13 a.m. to 3:21 a.m. Do not leave for any reason. 5. Do not allow Charlie inside the building. 6. Check salt line at 5:01 a.m. Repair if necessary. I read through the list twice, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. The first rule seemed reasonable enough. Older elevators could be unreliable, and maintenance probably didn't want anyone getting stuck overnight. The second rule made business sense too, preventing noise complaints from late arrivals disturbing other guests. But the rest of them felt increasingly strange. "Salt line?" I asked. Rebecca walked around the desk and pointed toward the lobby entrance. Near the glass doors, running in a straight line across the burgundy carpet, was what looked like a thin stripe of white powder. I'd noticed it when I walked in, but assumed it was some kind of decorative element or maybe residue from recent cleaning. Mr. Calhoun maintained that line every night. It's salt. He insisted it was essential for security purposes. Rebecca's tone suggested she found this as peculiar as I did, but had given up questioning it. He left detailed instructions for mixing and application in the office. "And Charlie? Former maintenance worker. Got fired about 6 months ago for drinking on the job, but he still shows up sometimes, usually drunk, trying to get inside. Mr. Calhoun was very specific about not letting him in." She straightened a stack of registration cards. "Look, I know these rules seem odd, but they work. The night shift has been problem-free since Mr. Calhoun established these protocols. Just follow them exactly, and you'll be fine." I folded the laminated sheet and slipped it into my shirt pocket. The job paid $15 an hour, which was 3 more than my previous job at the campus bookstore, and I only needed to work 3 nights a week to cover my rent and textbook expenses. Weird rules seemed like a reasonable trade-off. Rebecca spent the next 40 minutes showing me the basics. The computer system was straightforward, mostly just checking guests in and out, handling wake-up call requests, and dealing with the occasional noise complaint. She showed me how to access the maintenance request system, though she mentioned that most serious issues would wait until morning when James Wilson, the day maintenance worker, came in. The office behind the front desk was small but functional, with a desk, filing cabinet, and a small refrigerator that buzzed quietly in the corner. The overnight shift is usually quiet, Rebecca explained as she gathered her things. Most of our guests are business travelers who turn in early. You might get a few stragglers checking in late, but nothing too challenging. Just remember, no matter what happens, follow Mr. Calhoun's rules exactly. By midnight, I was alone in the lobby. The Grandview Hotel settled into its nighttime quiet, the kind of institutional stillness that seemed to make every small sound louder. The heating system clicked on and off with mechanical regularity. Somewhere upstairs, a door closed with the soft thud of heavy wood. Outside, occasional footsteps bounced off the sidewalk as late-night pedestrians made their way through downtown Portland. I spread my economics textbook open on the front desk and tried to focus on supply and demand curves, but my attention kept drifting to the strange rules in my pocket. Room 371 stays empty. Why that specific room? And what kind of security concern required a line of salt across the lobby floor? I'd worked at enough part-time jobs to know that management rarely put policies in place without good reasons, even if those reasons weren't immediately clear to employees. At 12:30 a.m., a middle-aged businessman checked in late, apologizing for his delayed flight. He seemed tired but polite, and I handed him his key card without any complications. By 1 a.m., the lobby was completely empty, except for me. I locked the front doors as Rebecca had instructed and settled back into my studying. The hours passed slowly. At 2 a.m., I took a break from economics to walk around the lobby, stretching my legs and getting used to the space. The salt line ran perfectly straight from one side of the entrance to the other, about 3 feet from the glass doors. Up close, I could see it was regular table salt, applied thick enough to be clearly visible against the dark carpet. Someone had taken considerable care to make it even and unbroken. When 3:13 a.m. approached, I remembered the 4th rule and went back to the office. I closed the door and sat at the desk, watching the minutes tick by on my phone. 3:13, 3:14, 3:15. The building remained perfectly quiet. I heard nothing unusual, no sounds that would explain why Mr. Calhoun had insisted on this particular 8-minute isolation period. By 3:21, I felt slightly foolish for following such a specific and apparently pointless instruction, but I'd been hired to follow procedures, not question them. The rest of the night passed without incident. I finished 2 chapters of economics reading and started outlining my upcoming paper on market equilibrium. A few times I looked toward the elevator, remembering the first rule, but I had no reason to use it anyway. All the guest rooms were accessible by stairs, and I wasn't planning to leave the lobby level. At 5 a.m., I approached the salt line for my required inspection. It looked exactly as it had when I'd examined it earlier, straight, unbroken, and precisely applied. I checked the ends where it met the walls, looking for gaps or disturbances, but found nothing that required repair. Whatever Mr. Calhoun's reasons for maintaining this line, it seemed to be holding up fine on its own. As dawn light began filtering through the lobby's glass doors, I realized I'd successfully completed my first night shift at the Grandview Hotel. The rules had seemed strange when Rebecca explained them, but following them had been simple enough. No guests had tried to use the elevator. Everyone had been in their rooms by 1 a.m. Room 371 hadn't been requested. No one named Charlie had appeared. The mysterious 8-minute office period had passed quietly. The salt line remained intact. I gathered my textbook and notes, feeling confident about the job. Whatever Mr. Calhoun's reasons for establishing these protocols, they'd kept the night shift running smoothly. And I could handle strange rules if it meant steady income and quiet study time. The work seemed manageable, even with its peculiarities. I walked into the Grandview Hotel lobby feeling much more confident than I had 2 nights earlier. Rebecca had left her usual stack of paperwork on the front desk, along with a note about a broken coffee maker in the third-floor break room that would need attention from James in the morning. Everything felt routine, manageable. I settled into the desk chair, pulled out my political science textbook, and checked the clock. 11:47 p.m. The night stretched ahead of me, predictable and calm. The lobby kept its institutional quiet, the same gentle buzz of heating systems and distant traffic that had provided the soundtrack to my first shift. I made my way through 2 chapters on congressional voting patterns, occasionally looking up when I heard footsteps on the sidewalk outside, or the distant ding of the elevator serving the day shift's final guests. By midnight, the building had settled into the same peaceful stillness I remembered from before. I was highlighting a passage about partisan polarization when the glass doors chimed with someone's approach. A woman in her 30s stood outside, well-dressed in a charcoal business suit, her blonde hair perfectly styled even at this late hour. She carried a small leather overnight bag and moved with the confident stride of someone used to late arrivals. I unlocked the doors and stepped aside to let her enter. "Good evening. Checking in?" Sarah Thompson. She approached the desk with brisk efficiency, her blue eyes scanning the lobby with obvious familiarity. "I need room 371. I felt my stomach drop slightly. Room 371 stays empty. No exceptions. That had been the 3rd rule on Mr. Calhoun's list, stated clearly and without explanation. I pulled up the reservation system on the computer, hoping to find her booking under a different room number, but no reservation appeared under Thompson at all. "I'm sorry, but I don't see a reservation under that name, and room 371 isn't available." Sarah's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. She leaned forward slightly, placing both hands flat on the marble countertop. "I specifically requested that room. I always stay in that room when I'm in Portland. The room is out of service indefinitely. I can offer you a comparable room on the 3rd floor, or we have several nice options on the 4th floor with city views." "I don't want a comparable room." Her voice remained level, but there was an edge to it now that made me uncomfortable. "I want room 371. I looked down at the laminated rule sheet in my shirt pocket, then back at Sarah's calm face. Mr. Calhoun had been very specific about this particular rule. No exceptions, no modifications. "I'm sorry, but that room really isn't available. Company policy." Sarah smiled then, and the expression didn't reach her eyes at all. It was the kind of smile that suggested she found my adherence to policy amusing rather than admirable. "The rules don't apply to me." Something about the way she said it made my hands feel cold. Not, "I'm a VIP guest" or "I have special status." Just a flat statement that the rules, whatever they were, somehow didn't apply to her. I looked at her for a long moment, trying to process the complete certainty in her voice. "Ma'am, I really can't. Room 371. She reached into her purse and placed a credit card on the counter. Now, I found myself reaching for a key card almost before I realized what I was doing. My hands moved automatically through the check-in process while my brain struggled to catch up. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. I was supposed to follow the rules exactly, no exceptions, but Sarah's expectation felt so complete, so certain, that refusing seemed impossible. The keycard programming machine beeped softly as it encoded room 371's access. I slid the card across the counter towards Sarah, already regretting the decision but unable to figure out how to reverse it. "Thank you." Sarah pocketed the keycard and turned toward the elevator without another word. She didn't ask about breakfast times or Wi-Fi passwords or any of the usual questions late-arriving guests posed. She simply walked away, her heels clicking against the burgundy carpet with mechanical precision. I watched her press the elevator call button and disappear behind the closing doors, feeling nervous for some reason I couldn't explain. I'd broken one of Mr. Calhoun's rules within an hour of starting my second shift. and I had no idea why. Something about Sarah's presence had made refusal feel impossible, as though the option simply didn't exist. The rest of the hour passed in uncomfortable reflection. I tried to return to my political science reading, but the words blurred together as I replayed the conversation. Sarah had known exactly which room she wanted, had expected resistance, and had somehow made my compliance feel inevitable. The more I thought about it, the more wrong the entire interaction felt. At 2 a.m., I was deep in an unsuccessful attempt to focus on electoral college mechanics when movement outside the glass doors caught my attention. A man stood on the sidewalk, swaying slightly, his face pressed close to the glass. He was maybe 50 years old, with several days of gray stubble and clothes that looked like he'd slept in them. His hair stuck up at odd angles, and his eyes had the bloodshot appearance of someone who'd been drinking heavily. He knocked on the glass with the heel of his hand, the sound carrying through the quiet lobby. Hey, open up! I work here!" I walked up to the doors carefully, remembering the 5th rule. Do not allow Charlie inside the building. This had to be Charlie, the fired maintenance worker Rebecca had mentioned, the one Mr. Calhoun had been specific about keeping out. "We're closed," I called through the glass. "You'll need to come back during business hours." "I work here, you idiot. I'm supposed to be here." Charlie's voice was muffled by the glass, but clearly agitated. "Open the damn door." "The hotel is closed to non-guests between 1 a.m. and 6 a.m. I can't let you in." Charlie's face darkened, and he pressed both hands against the glass, leaving smudged prints on the surface. "You don't understand. I belong here. This place, it needs me. I keep it running." His words slurred together, but his eyes had a focused intensity that seemed at odds with his apparent intoxication. "Just open the door, just for a minute." "I'm sorry, but I can't do that." Charlie stared at me through the glass for a long moment, his expression changing from anger to something that looked almost like hunger. He opened his mouth to say something else, and then he was gone. Not gone as in he walked away or stumbled off into the night. Gone as in he was standing there 1 second and the empty sidewalk was visible the next. No movement, no transition. Just there, then not there, as though someone had simply erased him from the scene. I stood frozen at the glass doors, staring at the spot where Charlie had been standing. The handprints he'd left on the glass remained, clear evidence that he'd been real, but the sidewalk beyond showed no trace of his presence. No footprints, no movement in either direction, nothing to suggest where he might have gone or how he disappeared so completely. I checked the street in both directions, looking for any sign of him, but the sidewalk remained empty, except for the occasional late-night pedestrian walking past blocks away. Charlie had simply vanished mid-conversation, leaving me standing at the locked doors. The clock on the front desk showed 2:17 a.m. when I finally backed away from the entrance and returned to my chair. I tried to convince myself that I'd been mistaken, that Charlie had simply moved out of my line of sight faster than I'd noticed. But the memory of his disappearance felt too clear and sudden to explain away. He'd been there, pressing against the glass, demanding entry, and then he'd been nowhere. I tried to return to my studying, but concentration proved impossible. Instead, I found myself looking repeatedly toward the glass doors, half expecting to see Charlie's face pressed against them again. The lobby felt different now, less like a quiet sanctuary and more like a place where strange things happened according to rules I didn't understand. The digital clock on the computer screen read 3:12 a.m. when I remembered the 4th rule and gathered my textbook to retreat to the office. I'd forgotten about the mandatory 8-minute isolation period until the last possible second, distracted by thoughts of Sarah's confident demand and Charlie's impossible disappearance. I closed the office door behind me and settled into the desk chair just as the clock clicked over to 3:13. The howling started immediately. It erupted from somewhere deep in the building. not from any specific direction I could identify, but as though it came from the walls themselves. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard, simultaneously animal and mechanical. A sustained note that seemed to vibrate through the floor and into my bones. It was the kind of sound that made every instinct scream to run, to get as far away as possible, as quickly as possible. The lights flickered with each crescendo, and I could feel the desk chair trembling beneath me. The howling rose and fell in waves, sometimes dropping to a low rumble that I felt more than heard, sometimes climbing to a pitch that made my teeth ache. Through it all, the building itself seemed to shudder, as though something massive was moving through its structure. I gripped the edge of the desk, my knuckles white against the dark wood, and forced myself to stay seated. The rule was specific. Remain in the office from 3:13 to 3:21, no matter what. Mr. Calhoun had emphasized this particular instruction, and after the night's earlier violations of his protocol, I was determined to follow at least this one correctly. The howling continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Windows rattled in their frames. The fluorescent light above the desk buzzed and flickered. Somewhere in the building I could hear doors slamming, though whether from the vibrations or something else entirely, I couldn't tell. At 3:21 exactly, the sound stopped. The silence that followed felt almost as oppressive as the howling had been. My ears rang in the sudden quiet, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. The building settled around me with a series of small creaks and clicks, like a house cooling after a hot day, and the fluorescent light steadied into its normal steady buzz. I remained in the office for another few minutes, waiting to see if the howling would resume, but the building stayed quiet. When I finally opened the door and stepped back into the lobby, everything appeared exactly as I'd left it. The computer screen still displayed my political science notes. My pen lay where I dropped it on the counter. The glass doors reflected the lobby's interior lighting, showing no signs of disturbance. The phone rang. I jumped at the sound, my nerves still raw from the experience in the office. The caller ID showed an internal extension, room 371. Front desk, this is Dylan. There's something scratching at my door. Sarah's voice sounded different over the phone, flatter, more mechanical than it had during our earlier conversation. It's been going on for several minutes now. Constant scratching, like claws on wood. I felt my stomach sink. Of course, there was a problem with room 371. I'd broken Mr. Calhoun's rules by letting Sarah check into that specific room, and now something was wrong. I'll come up and take a look. Which floor are you on? 3rd floor, room 371. The line went dead before I could respond. I locked the front desk drawer and took the master keyring from its hook behind the counter. The elevator waited across the lobby, its brass doors reflecting the overhead lighting, but the first rule bounced around in my mind. Never use the elevator between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. I pushed through the stairwell door instead and began climbing toward the 3rd floor. The stairwell was dimly lit, and my footsteps bounced with each step. By the 2nd floor landing, I could hear something, a rhythmic scratching sound coming from somewhere above me. It had the steady, persistent quality of an animal trying to dig through wood, sharp and deliberate. The sound grew louder as I climbed to the 3rd floor, until it seemed to fill the entire stairwell. I opened the door to the 3rd floor hallway, and the scratching stopped immediately. The hallway stretched ahead of me, lit by fluorescent fixtures that cast everything in harsh white light. Room 371 was at the far end, and I could see its door clearly from where I stood. The scratching had definitely been coming from this direction, but now the floor was completely silent. I walked slowly down the carpeted hallway, listening for any sign of movement, but heard nothing except the distant buzz of the building's ventilation system. When I reached room 371, I knocked gently on the door. Ms. Thompson, this is Dylan from the front desk. No response. I knocked again, louder this time. Ms. Thompson, you called about scratching? Still nothing. I used the master key to unlock the door and pushed it open slowly. The room was completely dark, but enough light came in from the hallway to show me that it was empty. Not just unoccupied, empty. No luggage, no personal belongings, no sign that anyone had ever checked in. The bed was made perfectly, the surfaces were dust-free, and the bathroom showed no evidence of use. I turned on the overhead light and checked more thoroughly. The closet was empty. The bathroom was spotless. There was no indication that Sarah Thompson had ever been in this room, even though I'd personally handed her the keycard less than 3 hours earlier. I stood in the doorway, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Sarah had definitely taken the elevator to this floor. She'd definitely called from this room's phone. But she was nowhere to be found, and the room looked as though it had been professionally cleaned and left vacant. The scratching sound started again. This time it was coming from inside the walls, a steady scraping that seemed to move from one side of the room to the other. I could hear it clearly now, not claws on wood, but something harder, more deliberate, like fingernails dragging across the inside of the drywall. I backed out of the room quickly, pulling the door closed behind me, and returned to the lobby as fast as the stairs would carry me. The scratching sound followed me down 2 flights, growing fainter with each floor but never stopping completely. Only when I was back at the front desk did the building return to its previous silence. The rest of the night passed in nervous watching. I couldn't concentrate on my studying, couldn't stop glancing toward the elevator doors, couldn't shake the image of that empty room that should have contained a guest. Every small sound made me jump. The heating system cycling on, a car passing outside, the distant settling of the building's old structure. At 5 a.m., I made my required inspection of the salt line. The white stripe that had been perfectly intact during my first shift was now broken in 3 places. The gaps were clean and precise, as though someone had carefully swept portions away rather than accidentally disturbing them. Each break was roughly 6 inches wide, creating openings in what was supposed to be an unbroken barrier. I found the salt supplies in a supply closet behind the front desk, exactly where Rebecca had indicated they would be. Mr. Calhoun had left detailed instructions for mixing and application, written in the same precise handwriting as the rule list. The process was simple but specific. Table salt, mixed with what the instructions labeled as blessed salt in a 3-to-1 ratio, applied in a straight line exactly 3 feet from the entrance. I worked carefully to repair each break, making sure the line was continuous and even. The salt felt normal, just salt. But there was something reassuring about following Mr. Calhoun's precise instructions. Whatever the purpose of this barrier was, maintaining it felt important in a way I couldn't explain. By the time Rebecca arrived at 7 a.m., the salt line was restored and the lobby looked exactly as it should. I'd removed Sarah Thompson's registration from the computer system, though I wasn't sure why. Room 371 showed as vacant and unavailable, just as it was supposed to. The night's events felt surreal in the morning light, like a strange dream that becomes harder to believe the more awake you become. But the repaired salt line was real. The broken registration was real, and somewhere in the building's silence I could still hear the faint sound of that impossible howling. I walked out of the Grandview Hotel that morning with my head buzzing from too much coffee and not enough sleep. Rebecca had accepted my brief explanation about the broken salt line without much interest, filing it under the general category of Calhoun's weird maintenance requirements. But the night's events wouldn't leave me alone as I drove home through downtown Portland's awakening streets. Sarah Thompson's disappearance, Charlie's impossible vanishing act, that empty room that should have contained a guest. None of it made sense within any framework I understood. Instead of heading straight back to my apartment, I found myself pulling into the parking lot of the Portland Public Library's Central Branch. The building wouldn't open for another hour, but I sat in my car and looked at the brick front, trying to decide if I was being paranoid or just curious. Something was clearly wrong with the Grandview Hotel, and Mr. Calhoun's rules weren't random safety protocols. They were defenses against something specific. When the library doors opened at 9 a.m., I was waiting outside with a cup of gas station coffee and a growing need for answers. The reference librarian, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and reading glasses on a chain, directed me to the local history section without asking why I needed information about downtown hotels. I settled into a corner table with a stack of city directories, newspaper archives, and historical surveys, spreading them out like evidence in a case I didn't yet understand. The Grandview Hotel had been built in 1924, according to the building permits I found in the city records. The address had previously housed the Marlowe boarding house, a 3-story wooden structure that served temporary workers and travelers from 1897 until it was torn down in 1923. I almost missed the significance until I started digging deeper into the newspaper archives from that period. The Marlowe boarding house had experienced what the papers delicately termed a series of unfortunate incidents between 1902 and 1908. 7 people had died on the premises during those 6 years, not from fire or structural collapse, but from what the articles described as unexplained circumstances. 3 guests had simply been found dead in their rooms with no apparent cause. 2 others had disappeared entirely, leaving behind their possessions but no trace of where they'd gone. 1 had been discovered at the bottom of the stairwell with injuries that didn't match a simple fall. The final death had been the owner himself, found in his office with what the coroner reported as signs of extreme agitation, but no clear cause of death. The boarding house had closed permanently in 1908, remaining empty for 15 years before the lot was cleared for the hotel's construction. I copied down the dates and details, my handwriting getting messier as the pattern became clearer. Whatever had been wrong with that original building, the new hotel seemed to have inherited the problem. I found the Grandview Hotel's employment records in a different archive, cross-referenced with newspaper want ads and business license renewals. The pattern was unmistakable once I knew to look for it. Night managers rarely lasted more than 6 months. The job seemed to turn over constantly, with brief periods that suggested people weren't just finding better opportunities, they were running away. Mr. Calhoun's 2-year employment was genuinely unusual. Most of his predecessors had quit within weeks. One had lasted only 4 nights before walking away mid-shift, leaving behind a resignation letter that simply read, "I can't do this anymore." Another had disappeared entirely, much like Calhoun himself, leaving behind only a brief note about needing to get away from this place. The guest complaints were harder to track down, scattered across decades of newspaper archives and buried in city council meeting minutes, but they formed a consistent thread. Reports of strange noises during overnight hours, claims of doors opening and closing on their own, guests who insisted their rooms had been occupied by someone else while they were away. Hotel management had consistently dismissed these reports as urban legends or the result of an aging building's quirks. One article from 1987 particularly caught my attention. A guest named Robert Chen had told reporters about encountering what he described as former hotel employees who tried to convince him to break basic safety rules. He'd been warned not to use the elevator after midnight, but claimed 2 staff members had encouraged him to ignore the restriction. When he'd asked the day manager about these employees, she'd insisted no such people worked at the hotel. Chen had checked out early and refused to provide further details. I photocopied everything I could find and left the library with a folder full of documentation that painted a picture I didn't want to believe. The Grandview Hotel wasn't just strange, it was dangerous, and it had been dangerous for a very long time. Mr. Calhoun's rules weren't arbitrary protocols, but hard-won knowledge about how to survive in a place that seemed to feed on people who broke its invisible boundaries. I spent the afternoon trying to study for my upcoming economics exam, but my mind kept drifting back to the research materials spread across my kitchen table. The pattern was too clear to ignore, too consistent across too many years to dismiss as coincidence. Whatever was happening at the hotel, it had been happening for over a century, and people like Mr. Calhoun had been fighting it one night move at a time. When I arrived at the hotel that evening for my 3rd move, James Wilson was replacing a burned-out hallway light on the 2nd floor. I'd seen him around during the day move transitions, but never actually spoken to him. He was a solidly built man in his 40s with calloused hands and the kind of patient expression that suggested he'd seen most of what the building could throw at him. "You're the new night guy," he said, looking down at me from his stepladder. "Dylan, right?" "That's me. How'd you know?" "Rebecca mentioned you." James climbed down and gathered his tools into a worn canvas bag. "You settling in okay? Night shift can be challenging here." Something in his tone made me pause. He wasn't making small talk about difficult schedules or dealing with drunk guests. There was something more behind his words, the same careful consideration I'd heard in Rebecca's voice when she'd talked about Mr. Calhoun's rules. "It's been interesting so far. I'm curious about Mr. Calhoun. What was he like before he disappeared?" James glanced around the empty hallway, then moved closer and lowered his voice. "Calhoun was a good guy when he started. Quiet, professional, took the job seriously. But toward the end, man, he got paranoid. Wouldn't take breaks, wouldn't leave the building during his shifts, kept talking about how the hotel was feeding on people who broke the rules." James shook his head. "I thought he was having some kind of breakdown. Turns out maybe he was just paying attention." "What do you mean?" "Night managers don't last here, never have. Most people quit fast, but the ones who stick around, they start seeing things, hearing things. Calhoun lasted longer than most, but it got to him eventually. He kept saying the building was alive somehow, that it needed people to break the rules so it could consume them." James hefted his tool bag onto his shoulder. "Sounds crazy when you say it out loud, but Calhoun wasn't crazy. He was scared. Do you think something happened to him?" "I think he figured out too much and couldn't handle it anymore. The night before he disappeared, he cornered me during shift change and made me promise to watch out for whoever replaced him. Said the hotel would try to claim them too, but maybe someone could break the pattern if they knew what they were fighting." James headed toward the stairwell, then paused and looked back at me. "Follow his rules exactly, Dylan. Don't try to be a hero. Don't think you can outsmart whatever's in this place. Just do the job and stay safe." By 11 p.m., I was alone in the lobby with my political science textbook and a growing sense of worry. The research from the morning had given context to the hotel's strangeness, but context didn't make the experience any less troubling. If anything, knowing about the Marlowe boarding house's history made every small sound feel more threatening. Every shadow seemed deeper. The night went normally until 1:30 a.m., when a guest stumbled out of the stairwell and approached the front desk. He was obviously drunk, probably in his 30s, wearing a rumpled business suit and carrying a briefcase that he kept dropping. His hotel key card dangled from a lanyard around his neck, and he moved with the exaggerated care of someone trying to appear sober. "Elevator's not working," he announced, slurring his words slightly. "Need to get to the 4th floor. The elevator's out of service overnight. You'll need to use the stairs." "Stairs are too..." He gestured vaguely, apparently unable to find the right word. "Just fix the elevator. I'm a guest here." I watched him walk unsteadily toward the elevator bay, where he jabbed repeatedly at the call button. The button lit up each time he pressed it, shining bright orange in the dimly lit lobby, but the doors remained closed. He kept pressing it, growing more agitated with each failed attempt. "It's broken," he called back to me. "The light comes on, but nothing happens. Use the stairs, sir. They're right behind you. I paid for an elevator." He continued pressing the button with increasing frequency, his movements becoming more desperate. The orange light blinked on and off like a warning signal, but the doors never opened, never even registered the call with their usual mechanical sounds. After 5 minutes of trying to push buttons, the guest gave up and stumbled back toward the stairwell, muttering complaints about hotel maintenance and false advertising. I watched him disappear through the fire door, then walked over to test the elevator myself. The call button worked perfectly. The doors opened immediately when I pressed it, showing the normal mirrored interior and brass fixtures. Whatever had stopped it from responding to the drunk guest, it wasn't a mechanical failure. The elevator had simply refused to work for someone who was trying to break the first rule. I went back to the front desk feeling more worried than the situation should have made me. The elevator wasn't just covered by a policy, it was somehow enforcing that policy on its own. The building itself was helping to maintain Mr. Calhoun's protective barriers. When 3:13 a.m. got close, I grabbed my textbook and went to the office with a bad feeling that had gotten stronger each night. The howling from my second shift hadn't been a one-time thing. It was a regular occurrence, something that happened every night during those 8 important minutes. I closed the office door and sat in the desk chair, watching the digital clock on the computer screen change to 3:13. The howling started right away, just like before. But tonight it wasn't alone. Heavy footsteps carried through the building above me, moving with clear purpose across what sounded like the 3rd floor. The footsteps were too heavy for a guest, too regular to be someone stumbling around in the dark. They moved from one end of the building to the other in a steady rhythm, like someone was pacing the hallway or doing a methodical search. I tried to focus on the computer screen, but the security camera monitor in the corner of the office caught my attention. The feeds from the different floors, which normally showed empty hallways lit by fluorescent lights, had turned to static. Every camera displayed the same gray interference pattern, making it impossible to see what was actually happening in the building during those 8 minutes. The howling reached its usual peak while the footsteps continued their relentless pace above me. The office walls seemed to shake with each sound, and I could feel the desk trembling under my hands. Whatever was happening in the building during this period, it was happening everywhere at once. In the elevator shaft, in the hallways, possibly in the rooms themselves. At 3:21 exactly, both sounds stopped. The security cameras came back to life, showing empty hallways and normal lighting. The building settled into its previous quiet with a series of small creaks and sighs, and I realized I'd been gripping the edge of the desk hard enough to leave marks in the wood. I waited several minutes before opening the office door, listening for any sign that the disturbance might start again. When I finally stepped back into the lobby, everything looked normal. The computer screen still displayed my political science notes. The front desk stayed exactly as I'd left it, and the security cameras showed no signs of movement anywhere in the building. I saw it when I walked around the front desk to check on the salt line. Muddy footprints led from the elevator across the burgundy carpet, clearly visible in the lobby's bright lighting. They were large prints, bigger than any guest's shoes I'd seen, and they went directly from the elevator doors toward the stairwell. I followed the prints up the stairs, my flashlight beam showing the trail as it continued to the 3rd floor. The muddy tracks led down the hallway to room 371, where they stopped suddenly at the door. There were no return prints, no sign of how whoever had made them had left the area. According to the computer system, no guests were registered on the 3rd floor at all. Room 371 stayed empty and unbookable, just as it was supposed to be. The other rooms on that floor were vacant, their doors closed and locked. But someone, or something, had walked from the elevator to room 371 during those 8 minutes when the cameras showed only static. I went back to the lobby and checked the salt line, which stayed perfectly intact. Whatever had left those muddy footprints, it hadn't needed to cross the barrier near the entrance. It had gotten into the building through some other way, possibly through the elevator itself. The rest of the night passed in tense watching. I couldn't concentrate on studying, couldn't stop thinking about those purposeful footsteps and the direct trail leading to the one room I wasn't supposed to book. Every sound made me look up from my textbook. Every movement outside the glass doors caught my attention. I felt watched throughout the entire shift, like something was watching me from the building's shadowy corners. When Rebecca arrived at 7 a.m., I had already mopped up the muddy footprints and returned the building to its normal appearance. I didn't mention the prints or the howling or the drunk guest's encounter with the non-responsive elevator. Instead, I gathered my things and headed home, carrying with me the growing certainty that the Grandview Hotel was far more dangerous than I had initially understood. The historical research had provided context, but it had also confirmed my worst suspicions. The hotel wasn't just strange, it was predatory, and whatever had claimed Mr. Calhoun was now turning its attention toward me. I sat in my car outside the Grandview Hotel for 10 minutes before my fourth shift, staring at the building's brick front and wondering if I was making a terrible mistake. The research from the library had painted a clear picture of what this place really was, and James Wilson's warning about Mr. Calhoun's fate bounced around in my mind every time I looked at those glass doors. But I needed this job, and more than that, I needed to understand what had happened to the previous night manager. Something told me that walking away now wouldn't solve the problem. It would just leave the next person completely unprepared for what waited inside. Rebecca met me at the front desk with her usual professional manner, but I caught her looking toward the elevator more than once while she told me about the night's maintenance requests. A second-floor guest had complained about scratching sounds in the walls, and the coffee maker on the third floor had broken again. She left these details on a sticky note attached to the computer monitor, along with a reminder that James would handle any serious issues in the morning. "Everything quiet otherwise?" I asked, settling into the desk chair as she gathered her things. "As quiet as it gets here." Rebecca paused at the door, her hand on the brass handle. "Dylan, you've been doing well with the night shift protocols. Keep following them exactly as written, all right? Don't try to be creative with the rules." The way she emphasized the word exactly made my skin crawl. Rebecca knew more than she let on about what those rules were really protecting against, but she'd clearly decided that ignorance was the safer option. I watched her disappear into the parking lot, leaving me alone with the hotel's silence and my growing collection of unanswered questions. By midnight, I'd managed to complete 2 chapters of reading for my political science class, but my attention kept drifting to the office behind me. Mr. Calhoun had worked from that same desk for 2 years, long enough to develop his defensive protocols through what must have been a series of increasingly dangerous encounters. He'd been methodical about everything else. Surely he'd left more detailed records somewhere beyond the laminated rule sheet. At 12:30 a.m., curiosity finally overcame caution. I locked the front door and carried my textbook into the office, settling into the worn desk chair that had been Mr. Calhoun's workspace. The desk itself was standard hotel furniture, probably installed when the building opened, with 3 drawers on the right side and a larger file drawer at the bottom. Rebecca had cleared out any personal items after his disappearance, but she might have missed something important. The top 2 drawers contained typical office supplies, pens, paper clips, a stapler that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The file drawer held maintenance requests dating back several months, along with staff schedules and vendor contact information. Nothing unusual, nothing that explained Mr. Calhoun's growing paranoia or his sudden disappearance. I was about to give up when I noticed that the bottom drawer seemed shallower than it should be compared to the others. Running my fingers along the inside back panel, I found a small gap where the wood didn't quite meet the drawer's frame. Pressure in the right spot caused the panel to move, revealing a hidden compartment just large enough to hold a small notebook. The leather-bound book was maybe 5 inches by 7 inches, filled with Mr. Calhoun's precise handwriting. The first entry was dated 2 months after he'd started the job, and the final entry was from the night before his disappearance. As I looked through his notes, a chill settled over me that had nothing to do with the office's temperature. Month 3, Week 2. The elevator responds to commands during day hours, but becomes selective after 11 p.m. Watched drunk guest press call button repeatedly with no response, then saw doors open immediately when I tested it myself. Building is enforcing the overnight restrictions automatically. Month 4, Week 1. Third guest this month has reported hotel employees encouraging rule violations. Descriptions don't match any current staff. Suspect the entities can mimic human appearance to some degree, using familiarity to lower defenses. Month 6, Week 3. Confirmed that room 371 serves as primary anchor point. Electromagnetic readings spike dramatically near that door during overnight hours. Salt line isn't just symbolic. It creates genuine barrier that prevents full manifestation in lobby area. Month 8, Week 2. Charlie Brennan disappeared last night after ignoring warnings about elevator use. Security footage shows him entering at 2:47 a.m. but never exiting. Elevator was empty when I checked at 6 a.m. Whatever these entities are, they're actively recruiting. Page after page detailed Mr. Calhoun's growing understanding of the hotel's supernatural ecosystem. The entities weren't random haunts. They were predators that had learned to use the building as a hunting ground. They needed people to break the protective barriers willingly, and they developed sophisticated strategies for manipulation and deception. Charlie hadn't just been fired for drinking. He'd been claimed by something that now wore his appearance to lure others into violating the rules. The final entries became increasingly desperate as Mr. Calhoun described feeling pulled toward the elevator during the 3:13 to 3:21 window. He'd started hearing voices calling his name from inside the shaft, promising answers to his questions about the hotel's history. The last entry was barely legible, written in shaking handwriting that suggested he'd been struggling to maintain control. They know I understand too much. Every night the pull gets stronger. Tonight I heard multiple voices, other night managers who disappeared over the years. They're all in there, in whatever space exists beyond the elevator doors. I can feel them trying to draw me in. If I'm not here tomorrow, someone needs to know. The rules aren't enough. The barriers are weakening. They're learning to work around the protections. I closed the notebook with hands that weren't entirely steady. Mr. Calhoun hadn't quit or had a breakdown. He'd been systematically targeted by entities that viewed him as a threat to their feeding ground. And now I was following the same path, asking the same questions, discovering the same terrible truths. The security monitor in the corner of the office had been cycling through different camera feeds while I looked through the notebook, showing empty hallways and vacant common areas. But something about the footage nagged at me, a sense that I was missing important details. I pulled up the archived recordings from the past few weeks, focusing on the overnight hours when most of the strange incidents had occurred. What I found made my stomach drop. The footage from 3 weeks ago showed a guest entering the elevator at 1:15 a.m., clearly violating the first rule. The camera captured him pressing the call button and stepping inside when the doors opened. But the elevator never moved. At 1:17, the doors opened again to reveal an empty car. The guest had simply vanished during a 2-minute elevator ride to nowhere. 5 days later, a woman had ignored the 1 a.m. curfew, wandering the lobby at 2:30 a.m. The cameras tracked her movement until she approached the stairwell door. The moment she touched the handle, the feed dissolved into static for exactly 30 seconds. When the image cleared, the lobby was empty. She never appeared on any other camera, never returned to her room, never checked out the next morning. Charlie appeared in multiple recordings, but his behavior was impossible according to normal physics. He would materialize outside the glass doors without walking into frame, disappear mid-conversation without moving away, and sometimes appear simultaneously on cameras from different floors. In one particularly disturbing sequence, he stood outside the lobby while his reflection in the glass doors showed a completely different appearance, translucent, with eyes that were completely black. I scrolled through hours of footage, finding incident after incident that the day staff had apparently never noticed or had chosen to ignore. Guests who broke rules disappeared without explanation. Figures appeared in locations that should have been empty. The elevator operated on its own, opening and closing its doors in patterns that suggested intelligence rather than mechanical malfunction. The clock showed 3:10 a.m. when I realized I'd been so absorbed in the recordings that I'd almost missed the mandatory isolation period. I quickly saved the footage I'd been reviewing and settled back in the desk chair, bracing myself for another 8 minutes of supernatural activity. The howling began at 3:13, louder than it had been on previous nights. The sound seemed to emerge from multiple directions at once, creating a chorus of inhuman voices that made the office walls vibrate. But tonight, underneath the mechanical wailing, I could hear something else. Human voices calling from somewhere deep in the building. Dylan! My name echoed from the direction of the elevator shaft. spoken in a voice I didn't recognize but that carried the desperate urgency of someone calling for help. The voice was muffled, as though it came from a great distance or through some kind of barrier. "Dylan, don't let them take you too." This voice was different, older, more authoritative. It could have been Mr. Calhoun, though the distortion made identification impossible. The sound seemed to come from inside the elevator shaft itself, from whatever space existed beyond the doors during these 8 important minutes. We tried to warn people. We tried to maintain the barriers, but they're getting stronger. More voices joined in, overlapping until I couldn't tell individual words apart. They seemed to be calling from different levels of the building, some close and urgent, others distant and carrying through the halls. The howling grew louder, drowning out the human voices until only that mechanical wailing remained. At 3:21, the sound stopped suddenly, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. I sat in the office for several more minutes, listening for any sign that the voices might start up again, but the building had returned to its normal quiet. The elevator doors were standing open. They'd never opened during previous nights, even with all the sounds coming from the shaft. Now they were wide open like a mouth, showing only darkness beyond the doorway. No light came from inside the car. No reflection showed on the mirrored walls. Just pure black emptiness that seemed to move slightly, like something was moving in the depths. I walked toward the elevator carefully, staying several feet away from the opening. The darkness inside wasn't still. It had a flowing quality that suggested depth far beyond what the building's design should have allowed. Looking into that blackness felt like staring into a pit that went much farther than the basement level. From somewhere in that darkness, I heard my name called one more time. The voice was clearer now, more insistent, and it carried a note of desperate pleading that made every instinct scream to step closer and listen. But Mr. Calhoun's notebook had been very specific about the elevator's true nature, and I'd seen enough security footage to understand what happened to people who entered it during overnight hours. I backed away from the opening and returned to the front desk, leaving the elevator doors standing open. After 10 minutes, they closed on their own with their usual mechanical precision, sealing whatever existed beyond them back into the darkness. At 5 a.m., I made my way to the lobby entrance for the required salt line inspection, expecting to find the usual minor breaks that could be easily repaired. Instead, I discovered that the entire barrier had been completely erased, not disturbed or accidentally broken, but carefully removed along its entire length, leaving no trace of the protective barrier that had kept the entities contained to the upper floors. In place of the salt line, someone, or something, had drawn symbols directly onto the burgundy carpet. The markings were maybe 2 inches tall, etched into the fabric with what looked like a sharp instrument. They formed a continuous pattern that ran the same path as the original salt line, but their meaning was completely foreign to me. The symbols had an angular, aggressive quality that made them uncomfortable to look at directly. I photographed the symbols with my phone before gathering the salt supplies from the storage closet. Following Mr. Calhoun's detailed instructions, I carefully mixed the blessed salt with regular table salt and applied it in a straight line exactly 3 feet from the entrance. The work was slow and precise, requiring constant attention to ensure the barrier was continuous and even. As I poured the salt mixture over the strange symbols, they seemed to resist being covered. The salt didn't stick properly to the carved areas, sliding away from the markings like it was being pushed by some invisible force. I had to apply multiple layers, working section by section, before the symbols were completely hidden beneath the white barrier. By the time Rebecca arrived at 7 a.m., the salt line was restored and the lobby looked exactly as it should. I'd removed all traces of the overnight disturbances, but I carried with me the growing certainty that the entities were escalating their campaign. They'd marked their territory, claimed their space, and made it clear that the protective barriers were no longer as secure as Mr. Calhoun had believed. The notebook was safely hidden back in its compartment, but its contents had fundamentally changed my understanding of the situation. I wasn't just working a strange night shift. I was the next target in a predatory cycle that had been repeating for decades. And like Mr. Calhoun before me, I was running out of time to find a solution before the entities found a way to claim me too. I spent the next 2 days in my apartment researching protective symbols and ordering supplies online, driven by the growing certainty that the entities were preparing for something bigger than their previous attempts. The carved symbols I'd found replacing the salt line hadn't appeared in any of my searches, but I'd managed to identify several traditional protective marks that might serve as backup defenses. Iron filings, blessed salt from 3 different religious supply companies, and a small container of black salt infused with protective herbs arrived via express shipping, along with a waterproof marker designed for drawing on carpets. My economics textbook remained unopened as I filled notebook pages with research about binding rituals and containment methods. Most of the information came from websites that looked questionable at best, but Mr. Calhoun's journal had proved that the supernatural followed certain rules, certain limitations that could be exploited by someone who understood the system. When I arrived at the Grandview Hotel for my 5th shift, I carried a backpack loaded with supplies and a printed folder containing protective symbols I'd found in different cultural traditions. Rebecca noticed the extra gear but didn't comment, simply providing her usual brief update about maintenance requests and guest concerns before disappearing into the parking lot. I sat at the front desk with my materials spread across the marble surface like tools for a job I'd never trained for but somehow inherited. The hotel felt different tonight, more heavy, as though the building itself was holding its breath in anticipation of something significant. Even the usual sounds seemed muted, creating an atmosphere of waiting that made my skin crawl. At 11:47 p.m., I checked the salt line and found it intact, but somehow less solid than before. The white barrier looked thinner, more fragile, as though something had been slowly draining its protective properties. I sprinkled additional salt along the entire length, reinforcing the barrier with the blessed mixture I'd prepared according to Mr. Calhoun's detailed instructions. The lobby remained empty until midnight, when Sarah Thompson walked through the glass doors with the same confident stride she'd displayed on my 2nd night. But this time I was watching for the details Mr. Calhoun's research had taught me to notice. Her footsteps made no sound on the burgundy carpet. Her reflection in the glass doors was subtly wrong, showing clothing that didn't match what she appeared to be wearing. And when she breathed, no fog appeared on the cold night air. "I need room 371, she announced, approaching the front desk with that familiar, cold smile. "I believe we've had this conversation before." "The room isn't available. It's permanently out of service." Sarah's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture that suggested barely contained frustration. She placed both hands flat on the marble countertop, and I noticed her fingers were longer than they should be, with joints that bent at unnatural angles. "You don't understand the situation, Dylan. The room belongs to me. It's always belonged to me. I understand perfectly. You're not Sarah Thompson. You're not even human. And you're not getting access to that room." The transformation began slowly, like a mask slipping rather than a sudden change. Her features stayed recognizably human, but became subtly wrong, in ways that hurt to look at directly. Her smile stretched too wide, showing teeth that were all canines. Her eyes lost their blue, becoming completely black from corner to corner. When she spoke again, her voice carried sounds that suggested multiple speakers talking in perfect unison. "The barriers are weakening, little guardian. We can feel your fear, taste your growing understanding. You know what happened to the man who came before you. You know what waits for all who try to contain us." I reached under the desk for the iron filings I'd prepared, keeping my movements slow and casual. The research had been consistent about iron's protective properties, and I wanted to test the theory before the situation escalated further. Mr. Calhoun lasted 2 years. I'm planning to do better. Sarah's laugh sounded like glass breaking, sharp and harsh. Her body began to change more dramatically, her size becoming impossible as her arms and legs stretched and her middle got thinner. The business suit she wore hung loose on a frame that was no longer entirely solid, more like an idea than something real. Calhoun thought he could study us, learn our weaknesses. He thought knowledge would protect him. Look where that confidence led. Movement outside the glass doors caught my attention. Charlie stood on the sidewalk, but he'd given up any pretense of appearing human. His shape moved between solid and see-through like a badly tuned television signal. His eyes were completely black, bouncing back the lobby lights like polished stone. When he pressed his hands against the glass, they left no prints, and I could see the street behind him through his chest. Sarah followed my look and nodded approvingly. "We're not playing games anymore, Dylan. The feeding ground has been contained too long. Tonight, we reclaim what was always ours." I scattered iron filings across the marble countertop between us, creating a barrier of small metal pieces that sparkled under the fluorescent lights. Sarah pulled back immediately, her changed features twisting into an expression of real pain. Where the iron particles came close to her hands, wisps of smoke rose from her skin. "Iron hurts, doesn't it? Good to know the research was accurate." Sarah backed away from the front desk, her form continuing to shift and distort. Her voice became a layered whisper that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. "You cannot maintain the barriers forever. We are patient. We have waited decades for the right moment, and that moment approaches. The building itself weakens your protections, draws power from your presence to feed our growing strength." I realized she was right. Each night I'd worked here, the strange incidents had gotten more intense, more direct. The entities weren't just testing the barriers, they were using my presence to somehow weaken them, turning my life force into energy they could use to expand their influence. Charlie had started moving along the glass doors, his see-through body flowing rather than walking. Where he touched the glass, frost patterns showed up and spread, creating detailed designs that hurt to look at directly. The cold seemed to get into the building itself, making the lobby temperature drop several degrees in minutes. "The salt line won't hold much longer," Sarah continued, her form now more shadow than substance. "We've learned to work around the old protections. Soon we'll claim this entire building, and then we'll spread beyond it. The city has so many potential feeding grounds, so many places where the barriers between worlds grow thin." I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing the bright beam toward Sarah's moving shape. She pulled back again, her outline becoming even less stable in the artificial light. Another useful piece of information. Whatever these things were, they liked darkness and had trouble staying together when directly lit up. "You're afraid," I said, keeping the light trained on her retreating figure. "All this talk about reclaiming territory, but you're actually terrified that I might succeed where Mr. Calhoun failed." Sarah's laugh became a shriek that broke one of the lobby's decorative vases, sending ceramic pieces flying across the carpet. Her body disappeared completely for a moment before coming back together several feet away, now more monster than human. Her arms and legs had stretched into something spider-like, and her face was an ugly copy of human features. "Fear is for creatures that can die, little guardian. We are beyond such limitations, but you are still beautifully fragile, still bound by the flesh that contains your essence. We will enjoy consuming that essence, adding your voice to our chorus of previous guardians." The lights in the lobby started to flash, making Sarah's movements look choppy and weird. Charlie had somehow passed through the glass doors without opening them, his see-through body now standing just inside the lobby's entrance. Where his feet touched the salt line, the white barrier started to smoke and break apart. I grabbed the container of blessed salt from my backpack and ran toward the entrance, pouring the mixture frantically along the breaking barrier. The salt made a hissing sound where it touched Charlie's essence, forcing his body to move back through the glass doors. But the damage was already done. Several feet of the protective line had been broken, creating gaps that would take time to fix properly. "The barriers fail," Charlie's voice echoed from outside, multiplying into a chorus of different speakers. "The feeding ground opens. The harvest begins." I worked quickly to restore the salt line while keeping the flashlight trained on Sarah's moving body. She had backed away to the far end of the lobby but hadn't disappeared entirely, staying there like a predator waiting for an opening. The iron filings on the front desk continued to shine, creating a small, safe zone that neither entity seemed willing to approach directly. The lobby clock read 3:10 a.m. when I finished repairing the salt line. I had 3 minutes to reach the office before the mandatory isolation period began. But something told me that tonight would be different. The entities were making their coordinated attack now, during the period when their power was strongest and the building's defenses were most weak. I grabbed my supplies and ran for the office, slamming the door just as the clock reached 3:13. But instead of the usual howling from the elevator shaft, I heard the mechanical sound of doors opening on their own. The elevator was operating without being called, its systems responding to commands from something that didn't need to press buttons or follow normal procedures. Through the office door, I could hear Sarah's inhuman laughter mixing with Charlie's multiplied voices. They were inside the building now, moving freely through spaces that should have been protected. The isolation period that had kept me safe during previous nights was no longer providing sanctuary. It had become a trap. The computer screen in the office blinked and went dark. The security camera monitors turned into static, then displayed images that couldn't be real. The cameras showed the lobby filled with dozens of see-through figures, all of them moving toward the elevator with synchronized purpose. Some wore hotel uniforms from different eras. Others appeared to be guests from various decades. All of them had the same black, empty eyes that marked them as claimed by whatever force controlled this building. From the elevator shaft came a sound I'd never heard before. Not howling, but human voices calling in desperate harmony. The voices of previous night managers, previous victims, all of them crying out warnings and pleas for help. Among them, clearer than the others, I heard Mr. Calhoun's voice. "Dylan, don't come to the elevator. They're using us as bait, making us call to you." The darkness inside. It's not just an elevator shaft anymore. It's a feeding space that exists between dimensions, and everyone who enters becomes part of their collective consciousness. I pressed against the office door, listening to the growing chorus of trapped voices. Mr. Calhoun continued speaking, his words barely audible above the others. "They're preparing to expand beyond the building. Room 371 is just the anchor point. The real feeding ground extends through the elevator shaft into spaces that don't follow normal physical laws. If they claim you, they'll have enough power to spread into the city itself." The voices got louder, more desperate, like the things were making their prisoners call out harder. I could hear my name being said by tons of different people, each one begging me to come to the elevator, to help them get out, to join them in whatever they'd been turned into. But under the human voices, I heard something else. A sound like breathing that came from the walls themselves. The building was alive somehow, kept going by the energy it took from people who broke its rules. The Grandview Hotel wasn't just a hunting ground. It was a living thing that ate human life and got stronger with each victim. I checked my phone and saw that only 2 minutes had passed since 3:13. 6 more minutes of this getting worse supernatural attack. 6 more minutes of fighting the huge urge to leave the office and help the voices calling my name. The door handle started to turn by itself, not from outside pressure, but from some force that was controlling the thing directly. The salt line in the lobby was breaking down fast now. I could hear it hissing and crackling as something ate through the protective wall. The iron filings on the front desk were losing their power, their shiny look fading as they were somehow drained of what made them protective. Every defense I'd set up was being torn down by forces that had learned to work around normal protections. At 3:21, the voices stopped suddenly, but the building didn't go back to its normal quiet. Instead, I heard footsteps moving through the lobby, way too many footsteps from way too many sources. The things had brought backup, calling out every spirit they'd claimed over the decades to join in tonight's attack. I waited another 5 minutes before opening the office door, expecting to find the lobby filled with hostile presences. Instead, I found something worse. The space looked completely normal, but felt totally wrong. The air itself seemed thicker, heavier, like the pressure had changed. The lobby lights made shadows that moved on their own, and the red carpet showed footprints from dozens of different shoes, all leading toward the elevator. The salt line had been completely destroyed, not just broken down, but scraped away entirely. In its place, someone had carved new symbols directly into the carpet, bigger versions of the markings I'd found after my 4th shift. These symbols covered the entire area near the entrance, making a complex pattern that seemed to move when I wasn't looking straight at it. I walked toward the elevator carefully, my flashlight pointed at the closed doors, but as I got closer, the doors opened without being called, showing darkness that was deeper and more complete than anything I'd seen before. The blackness inside moved with purpose, reaching toward the lobby like grabbing fingers. From that darkness, Mr. Calhoun's voice called one final time. "Someone must always guard the hotel, Dylan. Leaving means they spread beyond the building. The choice is containment or consumption. There is no escape." The elevator doors closed with mechanical precision, sealing the darkness back into the shaft. But the message was clear. I wasn't just working a night shift anymore. I was the guardian of a supernatural prison, responsible for keeping old predators contained within these walls. And if I failed, if I ran like so many others before me, those predators would follow me out into the world. I found the final note at dawn, tucked under the keyboard, where Mr. Calhoun knew I would eventually look. His handwriting was shakier than in the hidden journal, written by someone who understood exactly what fate awaited him. "Dylan, the barriers hold only as long as someone maintains them. The hotel needs a guardian, someone who understands the rules and follows them perfectly. I thought I could study them, find a permanent solution. I was wrong. They are patient, intelligent, and utterly ruthless. They will offer you knowledge, power, escape. Accept none of it. Guard the barriers, maintain the salt, keep them contained. Someone must always watch. Someone must always stay." Robert Calhoun. I folded the note and put it in my pocket, understanding finally that this job had never been temporary. The Grandview Hotel had claimed me just as surely as it had claimed Mr. Calhoun, not through supernatural force, but through moral necessity. I was the only thing standing between these entities and an unsuspecting city, and walking away would make me responsible for every life they claimed beyond these walls. I stared at Mr. Calhoun's final note for several minutes after Rebecca left. Someone must always watch. Someone must always stay. He'd accepted that fate for 2 years, keeping up the barriers and containing threats that could spread beyond the building if left unchecked. But containing them wasn't enough anymore. The entities had grown too strong, learned too much about working around the protections. Walking away wasn't an option. Even if I could live with abandoning the next night manager to face this alone, the entities had made it clear they were preparing to expand beyond the hotel. Sarah's words from the previous night came back to me. "Soon, we'll claim this entire building, and then we'll spread beyond it." They were using the hotel as a base of operations, not just a hunting ground. I spent the first hour of my 6th shift researching binding rituals on my laptop, cross-referencing information from a dozen different websites that dealt with supernatural containment. Most of the sources looked questionable, but I'd learned to separate useful information from wishful thinking. The consistent elements across different traditions were simple. Create permanent barriers using materials that disrupted spiritual energy, and redirect that energy back into its source. Iron was mentioned repeatedly as both a barrier and a focusing agent. Salt created temporary boundaries, but iron could make those boundaries permanent when properly applied. The trick was combining them at the right moment, when the entities were most vulnerable and their connection to their anchor point was strongest. I pulled the container of iron filings from my backpack and mixed them with the blessed salt in a 3-to-1 ratio, following proportions I'd found in an old grimoire digitized by a university library. The mixture felt different from the standard salt combination, heavier, more substantial, as though it contained potential energy waiting to be released. By 10 p.m., I had reinforced the lobby's salt line with the iron mixture, creating a barrier that looked similar to the original, but felt completely different under my hands. The white powder now had a metallic shine that caught the fluorescent lights, and when I walked across it accidentally, a brief shock ran through my sneakers like static electricity. I arranged additional supplies around the front desk, a second container of the iron salt mixture, Mr. Calhoun's hidden notebook open to his notes about Room 371's properties, and a printed page of binding symbols I'd found in 3 different sources. The symbols were simple geometric patterns, but each one was supposed to redirect spiritual energy in specific ways when drawn with the right materials. The lobby felt different tonight, charged with anticipation that made the air itself seem to vibrate. The hotel's usual institutional sounds were muted, as though the building was holding its breath before something significant. Even the electrical buzz seemed subdued, creating an atmosphere of waiting that made my skin crawl with nervous energy. At midnight exactly, Sarah Thompson walked through the glass doors, but she'd abandoned any pretense of appearing human. Her body flickered between solid and see-through, and her proportions changed constantly as though she couldn't maintain a stable appearance. When she moved, her feet made no sound on the carpet, and the fluorescent lights dimmed automatically as she approached the front desk. Charlie appeared beside her without entering through the doors, his see-through body more solid than I'd seen before. His appearance had stabilized into something that looked almost real, but his eyes remained completely black, and his voice carried harmonics that suggested multiple speakers talking in unison. "The barriers grow weak, little guardian," Sarah announced, her voice layered with frequencies that made my teeth ache. "Tonight, we reclaim what has always belonged to us." I stood behind the front desk with the iron salt mixture within easy reach, keeping my flashlight trained on both entities. The bright beam caused their forms to waver and lose cohesion, confirming that artificial light remained an effective deterrent. "Tonight, I'm sealing Room 371 permanently," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I'm cutting off your anchor point and trapping you where you can't hurt anyone else." Sarah's laugh was harsh and grating, like metal scraping against metal. Her body started changing more dramatically, her arms and legs stretching into something spider-like while her torso got impossibly thin. The business clothes she wore hung loose on a frame that didn't look human anymore. "You think you understand our nature, but you know nothing of our true strength. We have fed here for over a century, claimed dozens of guardians, grown powerful beyond your comprehension." Charlie moved closer to the salt line, his multiplied voice speaking in perfect harmony with Sarah's words. Where his feet approached the iron-enhanced barrier, wisps of smoke rose from the carpet, and a smell like burning metal filled the lobby. The others thought they could contain us too. They learned the futility of resistance when we claimed their essence, added their voices to our chorus of servants. I scattered iron filings across the marble countertop, creating a defensive barrier between myself and the entities. Both Sarah and Charlie recoiled from the metallic particles, their forms becoming less stable as the iron disrupted whatever energy allowed them to manifest in this space. The difference is, I'm not trying to contain you anymore. I'm going to bind you permanently to your anchor point and seal it off completely. No more feeding, no more claiming victims, no more spreading beyond this building. Sarah's form dissolved entirely for a moment before reforming several feet away, now more shadow than substance. Her voice became a layered whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The elevator shaft extends beyond physical space, little guardian. We exist in dimensions that follow different rules. You cannot seal what exists outside your reality. I checked the lobby clock and saw it was 3:10 a.m., 3 minutes until the isolation period began, 3 minutes until the entities would be at their strongest and most vulnerable. Instead of going back to the office like every previous night, I grabbed my bag of iron salt mixture and headed toward the elevator. Then I'll meet you in that space and seal it from the inside. The elevator doors were already standing open, showing darkness that moved with purpose. The blackness inside looked deeper than it should be, and looking into it felt like staring into a pit that went down through different dimensions. From that darkness came the familiar sound of human voices, Mr. Calhoun and dozens of other victims calling my name with urgent need. I walked up to the doorway carefully, keeping the flashlight beam pointed at the opening. The light made the darkness pull back a little, creating a small, safe area near the elevator's entrance. At exactly 3:13 a.m., I poured the iron salt mixture across the doorway in a straight line, blocking the path between the elevator car and the lobby. The reaction was immediate and violent. The darkness inside the elevator pulled back with pained howling that shook the entire building, and the walls themselves seemed to twist as though the hotel was in physical pain. The iron salt barrier glowed with pale fire where it touched the supernatural darkness, creating a boundary that neither realm could cross. From the depths of that otherworldly space, a figure stumbled toward the light. Mr. Calhoun, but barely recognizable as human after weeks of captivity in whatever dimension existed beyond the elevator doors. His clothes hung in pieces on a body that had been stretched and twisted, and his skin looked see-through, suggesting he was only partially present in normal reality. "Dylan," he gasped, his voice weak but clear. "The binding symbols, draw them in the salt while the barrier holds. Redirect their energy back into room 371 and seal the anchor point permanently." I pulled out the printed page of binding symbols and began drawing the geometric patterns in the iron salt mixture with my finger. Each symbol glowed briefly as I completed it, creating a complex array that seemed to pull energy from the surrounding air and focus it toward the elevator shaft. Mr. Calhoun stumbled fully into the lobby, his body becoming more solid as he moved away from the supernatural darkness. Together, we completed the binding pattern, connecting each symbol to the others with precise lines that formed a containment network extending from the elevator to room 371 directly above. The hotel shuddered as the binding took effect, walls groaning and lights flickering throughout the building. Sarah and Charlie's bodies began dissolving involuntarily, their essence being pulled back toward their anchor point by forces they could no longer resist. Sarah's spider-like appearance collapsed into itself, while Charlie's multiplied voice became a single, desperate scream. "This will not hold forever," Sarah managed to say as her form was dragged toward the elevator shaft. "Others will come. Other guardians will fail. We are patient beyond your understanding." "Then they'll find empty rooms in ordinary elevators," I replied, watching the entities disappear into the darkness that was already beginning to contract and fade. The elevator doors slammed shut hard, sealing the supernatural space away from normal reality. The binding symbols kept glowing for several minutes before fading to leave permanent marks burned into the carpet, a visible reminder of the barrier that now contained the entities permanently within their anchor point. Mr. Calhoun collapsed into one of the lobby chairs, his body gradually becoming more solid and human as the supernatural influence faded from his system. He looked older than his 47 years, but his eyes were clear and focused for the first time since his disappearance. "It's done," he said simply. "The binding will hold as long as the physical barriers remain intact, but someone will need to monitor the containment, ensure the seals don't weaken over time." By dawn, I had called James Wilson and explained enough of the situation to get his help with the permanent containment measures. We used industrial adhesive to seal the elevator doors, then installed a steel plate over the entire opening. Room 371's door was welded shut with help from a contractor James knew who didn't ask questions about unusual requests. The salt line in the lobby was replaced with a permanent iron strip embedded directly into the carpet, creating a barrier that couldn't be easily removed or damaged. The binding symbols were covered with clear protective coating, preserving them as part of the containment system. I submitted my resignation to Rebecca before she arrived for her morning shift, citing personal reasons that required me to leave immediately. She accepted the news with professional calm, though I caught her looking toward the sealed elevator with an expression that suggested she understood more about the hotel's true nature than she'd ever admitted. James Wilson agreed to take over monitoring the containment areas, armed with Mr. Calhoun's research and a clear understanding of what he was protecting the city from. The entities were trapped, but not destroyed, contained within their anchor point, where they could no longer spread or claim new victims. The Grandview Hotel went back to being an ordinary mid-tier business hotel, its dark secrets sealed away behind steel and iron. Guests would never know how close they'd come to meeting predators that had fed on human essence for over a century, or that their safety depended on barriers maintained by someone who understood the price of vigilance. I left Portland that afternoon, but I kept Mr. Calhoun's notebook and the knowledge it contained. Somewhere else, another hotel or building might be harboring similar threats, and someone would need to recognize the signs and know how to respond. The cycle of supernatural predation had been broken at the Grandview, but the responsibility for protecting others would continue wherever darkness gathered and fed on human lives.